They did not arrive as conquerors at first. They arrived as traders, missionaries, explorers, and mapmakers. They came with Bibles in one hand and trade agreements in the other. They spoke of civilization, progress, and partnership. They mapped rivers, studied coastlines, and built forts along the shores. For centuries, European powers had touched the edges of Africa, trading gold, ivory, spices, and, most brutally, human beings. But by the late 19th century, something changed. What had once been coastal influence turned into a hunger for control. Europe was transforming. The Industrial Revolution had reshaped economies and societies. Factories demanded raw materials: rubber, cotton, palm oil, copper, diamonds. Growing populations demanded new markets for manufactured goods. National pride demanded overseas empires. Power was no longer measured only by armies on the continent, but by territories across oceans. Africa, vast and resource-rich, became the focus of that ambition. For centuries, much of Africa had remained politically and socially organized under its own kingdoms, empires, and communities. The Ashanti Empire thrived in West Africa. The Zulu Kingdom commanded respect in the south. Ethiopia stood as a sovereign empire with ancient traditions. The Sokoto Caliphate governed large territories with complex administrative systems. These were not empty lands waiting to be discovered. They were homes to civilizations with histories stretching back thousands of years. Yet in European capitals, Africa was often portrayed as a blank space on the map. In 1884, leaders of Europe gathered in Berlin. There were no African representatives at the table. The purpose was clear: to regulate competition and avoid war among European powers as they divided Africa among themselves. Lines were drawn on maps with rulers and ink. Rivers and mountains were used as borders when convenient. Straight lines cut across ethnic groups, languages, and trade routes. Communities that had long interacted peacefully were separated. Rival groups were forced within the same artificial boundaries. This was the beginning of what became known as the Scramble for Africa. Britain, France, Germany, Belgium, Portugal, Italy, and Spain rushed to claim territory. They signed treaties with local leaders, sometimes under false pretenses, sometimes through coercion, sometimes through misunderstanding caused by language barriers. A mark on paper became justification for occupation. Where treaties failed, guns followed. Military technology gave Europe a decisive advantage. The Maxim gun, a powerful machine gun, could mow down resistance that relied on spears or outdated rifles. Battles that once might have been prolonged became one-sided slaughters. The Zulu Kingdom fell after fierce resistance. The French subdued West African kingdoms after long campaigns. The British crushed uprisings in Sudan and South Africa. Germany suppressed revolts in East Africa with devastating force. But perhaps nowhere was colonial brutality more extreme than in the Congo Free State. King Leopold II of Belgium claimed the territory not as a Belgian colony, but as his personal possession. Under the guise of humanitarianism and anti-slavery efforts, his agents forced Congolese communities into rubber collection quotas. Villages that failed to meet quotas faced punishment: whippings, hostage-taking, mutilation. Hands were cut off to prove that bullets had not been wasted. Entire communities were destroyed. Millions are believed to have died during this period of exploitation. The wealth generated from Congolese rubber enriched Leopold and financed grand buildings in Belgium, while the people who produced it suffered unimaginable horrors. Across the continent, colonial rule reshaped African societies. Colonial governments introduced new administrative systems. Some ruled indirectly, governing through local chiefs who were required to answer to European authorities. Others ruled directly, replacing traditional leadership structures entirely. In both systems, ultimate power rested with colonial officials. Economic systems were transformed to serve European interests. Cash crops replaced subsistence farming. Land was seized and given to European settlers in regions like Kenya, Algeria, and South Africa. Africans were taxed in money rather than goods, forcing them into wage labor on plantations, in mines, or in colonial infrastructure projects. Railways were built, not to connect African communities, but to transport raw materials from the interior to ports. Roads led to mines and plantations, not between villages. Education systems were introduced, often run by missionaries. While literacy expanded in some regions, the curriculum frequently emphasized European languages, history, and values. Indigenous cultures were often dismissed as inferior or primitive. Traditional belief systems were discouraged or banned. Christianity spread widely, altering spiritual landscapes that had existed for centuries. Colonial powers justified their actions with ideas of racial superiority. Social Darwinism and pseudoscientific theories claimed that Europeans were destined to rule. The so-called civilizing mission was presented as a moral duty. But behind the language of civilization was a reality of extraction, control, and profit. Resistance, however, never disappeared. In Ethiopia, Emperor Menelik II modernized his army and defeated Italy at the Battle of Adwa in 1896. It was a rare and powerful African victory against a European power, preserving Ethiopia's independence. In West Africa, Samori Touré fought French expansion for years before being captured. In southern Africa, the Herero and Nama peoples resisted German rule, only to face a campaign of extermination that historians now recognize as genocide. In Kenya, the Mau Mau uprising challenged British authority decades later. Across the continent, rebellions erupted repeatedly, even when crushed. World War I and World War II further altered the colonial landscape. African soldiers were recruited in large numbers to fight in European wars. They fought in trenches in Europe, in deserts in North Africa, and in jungles in Asia. They witnessed the vulnerability of European powers. They experienced ideas of freedom and self-determination being discussed on global stages. When they returned home, many began to question why those principles did not apply to them. After World War II, the tide began to turn. European powers were weakened economically and militarily. Anti-colonial movements grew stronger and more organized. Leaders emerged who would shape a new era. Kwame Nkrumah in Ghana called for Pan-African unity and independence. Jomo Kenyatta in Kenya mobilized nationalist sentiment. Ahmed Ben Bella in Algeria fought for liberation from French rule. Julius Nyerere in Tanzania advocated for self-reliance. Patrice Lumumba in the Congo demanded genuine sovereignty. Independence movements varied in strategy. Some achieved freedom through negotiation. Ghana became the first sub-Saharan African country to gain independence in 1957 through largely peaceful means. Others endured prolonged and bloody wars. Algeria's war against France lasted 8 years and cost hundreds of thousands of lives. Angola and Mozambique fought long conflicts against Portuguese rule. In South Africa, colonialism evolved into apartheid, a rigid system of racial segregation that would last until the 1990s. By the 1960s, much of Africa had formally gained independence. Flags were lowered, new anthems were sung, constitutions were written. The era of formal colonial rule was ending. But the legacy of colonization did not disappear with independence. Artificial borders remained, contributing to internal conflicts. Economies designed for extraction struggled to diversify. Many newly independent states depended on exporting a single commodity, making them vulnerable to global price fluctuations. Political systems inherited from colonial administrations sometimes lacked deep local legitimacy. Cold War rivalries pulled African nations into global ideological struggles as the United States and the Soviet Union sought influence. Infrastructure built during colonial times often served narrow purposes and required restructuring. Education systems continued to rely on colonial languages such as English, French, and Portuguese as official mediums of governance and instruction. Cultural identities had been reshaped, sometimes fractured, by decades of imposed hierarchies and racial classifications. At the same time, colonization left complex legacies. Railways, legal systems, and certain administrative institutions became part of post-colonial states. Urban centers grew around colonial trade hubs. Shared languages facilitated communication across diverse ethnic groups within new nations. The story was not simple, not entirely one-dimensional. It was marked by suffering and resilience, loss and adaptation. Today, debates about colonization continue. Some argue that colonial infrastructure laid foundations for modernization. Others emphasize that development primarily served European interests and often hindered balanced growth. Museums in Europe face questions about artifacts taken during colonial rule. Discussions about reparations and historical accountability gain momentum. Statues of colonial figures are removed in some cities, defended in others. For many Africans, the memory of colonization is not distant history. It is woven into family stories, economic realities, and political institutions. It is present in the borders on maps, the languages spoken in classrooms, the patterns of trade that still link African economies to former colonial powers. The colonization of Africa was not a single event. It was a process, decades of conquest, administration, resistance, and transformation. It was driven by industrial ambition, national rivalry, racial ideology, and economic greed. It reshaped an entire continent and altered the course of global history. It connected Europe and Africa in ways that remain deeply intertwined. It created wounds that are still healing. It sparked movements that inspired liberation struggles around the world. It stands as one of the most consequential chapters in modern history, reminding us that the lines drawn in distant rooms can change millions of lives, and that the pursuit of power without justice leaves echoes that last for generations.